If I told you that one of my dream jobs would be to write the Lonely Planet Guide to Industrial Australia?
You've never told me that, and I'm super curious why that is.
Well, I love touring big bits of kit. I just really love it. And I'm technology agnostic. I don't care if it's a desal plant or some wind turbines or a solar farm or a smelter, even a coal mine. I don't care. I just really like visiting them. What about you? Because you do go into big facilities and help them find ways to cut emissions that cause climate change. Are you ever in one of those places with your hard hat on and you just want to say,
my gosh.
Stop
Absolutely.
asking me questions for a few minutes. I'll answer them, but this place is awesome. And first, I just want to enjoy it. Like, is that ever, how do you feel about it?
You have hit the nail on the head, Murray. These moments of like, okay, obviously there's a lot of climate impacts of these facilities, but the engineering efforts over decades that had been put into, designing and thinking about these processes and evolving these before we even understood climate change or had an understanding of climate change. You have to appreciate that history. I can't help but appreciate that history. There's like my inner child is a little engineer, like a kid with a big truck, kind of just being satisfied by these massive, sometimes rusty, like impressive pieces of technology.
Yes.
Absolutely.
The closest I ever got to having a job like that, where I actually got to go into some of these places, was back in the day when I used to write a health and safety newsletter for WorkCover. And I did get to go to some really interesting places. Yeah. I went into a Qantas aircraft hangar, which was kind of the highlight. And unfortunately, it was in that job, which was quite interesting, that I learnt the hard way the importance of carefully proofreading anything that I write.
Oh no, what happened?
So the assignment was to do a cover story on WorkCover's new building, which was being opened by the minister, who was going to give a speech and unveil the plaque. And anyway, to my horror, as soon as the newsletter was distributed, I realised that I had captioned a photo of the smiling minister with the words, "The Minister for Industrial Relations unveils the plague at 400 Kent Street."
The plague.
Hello, Francisca Curran.
Hello, Murray Griffin. How are you today?
I'm good. And yes, very exciting chat today.
Absolutely. We've got three diverse, interesting and extremely knowledgeable individuals to talk to us about industrial decarbonisation.
Yes, we have Margi Johnson, who's the Chief Executive of the Australian Aluminium Council.
And secondly, we've got Ben McGarry, who's the decarbonisation practice leader for Australia for Aurecon.
And we also have Trent Hawkins, who is Consulting Director with ERM Energetics. And so, yes, they had some great insights to share. So let's jump straight into the chat.
Let's do it.
Hello, Margi, Ben and Trent, and welcome to Track Changes.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
Look, I've got to say, I feel a bit like the dilettante in today's episode, because the three of you have lots of hands-on experience in working on strategies to cut emissions in heavy industry, and so does Francisca. So I'm going to ask the first and last questions today, but basically Francisca will guide us through the chat. But my first question is this: could I ask each of you first up, what motivates you to do the work that you do, and what's been a career highlight so far? And Margi, I might start with you first.
Thanks, Murray. And I guess for me, I've always wanted to live in a country that makes things. And aluminium is one of the best examples of that. It's one of only two products which goes from mine to market here. So you want to only two things which you can literally buy off the shelf, which was, at Bunnings, which was mined, refined, smelted, extruded, and manufactured. And as someone who's worked in the industry for more than 30 years now, showing my age, but I would like to say, I guess, my highlight is the recognition of what aluminium contributes to our society, and I guess my small role in helping lift the profile of that domestic manufacturing we have and the sovereign capability here in Australia. And how that, my role is, I guess, translated to the fact that a few facilities which have been at turning points over the last 15 years of, does Australia want to be a country that makes energy intensive products? Most of those are still open today, and I've helped, I guess, had a role in maintaining jobs for tens of thousands of Australians, as well as creating some new ones.
Terrific. That's a great answer, Margie. Thanks for that. Trent, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, look, for me, I started working in sector decarbonisation planning in 2009 when I was working at Beyond Zero Emissions. And we thought that 2010s was a critical decade back then. And so we're in 2026 and we're still fighting the fight on to keep climate change on the agenda. But, I think there's been a massive shift in the debate since then, reflecting earlier on it, that today we can talk about 100% renewable energy being a reality that's possible. We have major companies that are talking seriously about how they invest in decarbonising their operations, even if it's hard. So it's, I think for me, the possibility of realising transformational change in how we produce goods and services and lead to a positive net impact on the environment continues to motivate me. It might still be challenging, but I think, there's the part of the challenges is what's exciting as well. And I guess what I also love is I get to see some of the ideas that I worked on 15 years ago or so being realised in reality, and going to the factories and going to the sites and seeing these projects being implemented in reality.
Another great answer. And finally, Ben, your motivation and your career highlight.
I'd love to say that I just want to make the world a better place. But honestly, what motivated me from the beginning was more than anything, learning new things through solving really difficult challenges and addressing the energy transition and the climate challenge. I think it's fair to say it's the greatest challenge of my lifetime. I'm too young to have had a hand in the space race or, be part of the microcomputing revolution, but those things were sort of racing into the future and unlocking opportunities in this sort of aspirational way. But the climate challenge feels more like, how do we make sure we don't get it wrong for the good of the future generations? And it's such a messy challenge, you're forced to learn continuously and learn fast if you want to create change. And it's about technology and people and vested interests and values and protecting our ecosystems. And you extrapolate that out across all the future generations. So it's a big deal, and it's really motivating for me. And it's the first really challenge I can think of that requires us to sort of advance our consciousness at a global scale. And it requires us to be better people and better thinkers and better community members. So I wouldn't say there's one highlight. I actually feel like my career highlight's still ahead of me. I just feel really privileged along the way to have been around and do that learning when things have been really changing fast. Trent mentioned renewable energy in the 90s, going from a sort of curiosity to solar PV plummeting in the 2000s. And, like Trent said, it felt like that was going to happen fast from that point and not lose a decade. But watching and being a part of what's happened to energy markets since, and likewise now seeing batteries dropping in costs and escalating in scale and doing really clever things, keeping the grid stable. That's inspiring and motivating for me, seeing the projects sort of manifest and supporting our energy intensive economy that Margie mentioned. And then, I might not have started there, but as I mature and get older, I do now value more and more the fact that work and my work helps the people and planet along the way.
Terrific. Well, those are three great answers. Over to you, Francisca.
Thanks, Margie, Ben and Trent. What inspiring answers. And I think a common thread there was obviously overcoming challenges, of which obviously large facilities in Australia face many. We're keen to get your take on how seriously Australia's heavy industries are trying to cut greenhouse gas emissions from their facilities. What are big industrial facilities generally doing right? And are there things that they often get wrong? Maybe we'll start with you, Ben.
Thanks. Yes, absolutely. Australia's heavy industries are seriously evaluating how to cut their emissions. That's probably slightly different from your question of, trying to cut emissions. So they're evaluating, but there are a few things that stand between that evaluation and actual emissions reductions. And, primarily that's the lack, if you like, of risk appetite around deployment of those new technologies, or maybe not risk appetite, but, there's a level of prudent caution considering the value that's at risk of deploying new technologies. And these companies in their DNA create procurement functions and commercial positions that kind of assume the market will provide the technologies they need at the pricing and the timing they need them. And that doesn't really happen in practice. Or, realistically, it's fairly far back in corporate memory that you've got to think of times where they had to take those risks. So automation and digital control maybe was the most recent case. So you've got that sort of inherent prudent hesitance, if you like. And then also there's this real mismatch between the rate of change of our technologies and our energy markets and the demands of buyers. And that volatility is sort of mismatched with the decision-making process. To make a large investment decision might take 3, 6, 9, 12 months or more. And in the meantime, things have changed again. So that it can sort of have a little bit of circularity there. So I wouldn't say they're doing that wrong, but I'd say the pace is a challenge. That governance strength makes it hard to make decisions when you've got hundreds of billions of dollars swinging on that investment. So what they're doing is doing the really detailed granular studies to get it right. So that's doing it right because you've got to do that. But what they can get wrong is sort of mistaking short-term noise from a long-term signal. So the short-term noise is, what are daytime prices doing in the electricity market? What are the quarterly electricity futures looking like? What's the levelized cost of lithium-ion batteries, or what's gas doing? Like, they're all noisy. They move around a lot, but the signal is, the world is decarbonizing, and global systems of governance and global flows of capital and political leadership, they all point to a demand for a more sustainable future. And there's a bit of a mismatch there. Like in a large emitter, the governance systems make it very attractive for decision makers to just ignore the signal and use the noise as an excuse to kill or defer business cases. And so it requires sort of personal leadership and personal champions and stakeholders within those big businesses. So, we really need to value and treasure those people that are moving the ball forward, notwithstanding some of the barriers they're facing.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I love that. The leadership required to see the bigger picture and the broader trends and where we're meant to be heading. Thanks for that. I'll pass over to Trent next.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's a lot of great points that Ben was making there. I certainly resonate with the challenges going beyond evaluation to sort of realising the projects. I mean, I think a lot of Australian businesses are taking decarbonisation very seriously, and they have got significant plans. They are trying to invest resources to sort of realise those projects. But I think what we're hearing is that it's a struggle to access sufficient investment and capital in the Australian market to sort of see these projects come to fruition. So definitely see there's a challenge. And I think I was thinking about it the other day, I think one of the challenges is that in terms of what are the things they're getting wrong, this is not uniform, but I think a lot of businesses are waiting till the business case becomes viable for 100% decarbonisation or 100% electrification. So we'll kick the can down the road 5 years till now we know at that point we're confident that we can sort of invest in that and meet our investment hurdle criteria. I think what really needs to be looking at is how we can actually lower the bar to entry to give corporates and industrials the opportunity to try things out, get a bit more hands-on experience, get more comfortable with it. A lot of the clients we work with, we're talking about partial electrification. I'm sure that Ben and others and Margi probably see examples of that where maybe you can go for, a heat pump to replace some of your space heating systems, but you don't have to do 100%, just to lower that barrier to entry. And the other thing I think is that whilst we have to lower the barrier to entry, we also have to raise the expectation of the cost and effort it's going to take to decarbonise. And I think one of the things that I've seen a lot of is, net zero strategies written 5 years ago had lots of really great numbers in there for how much it's going to cost and what sort of paybacks are going to be realised. And they were only ever kind of initial sketches. But, 5 years on today, those businesses going back and looking at going, well, hang on, that we haven't seen that payback realized. So it's not quite the well, it's more complicated and costly than people had thought 5 years ago.
Yeah, had initially calculated. Oh, thanks for that, Trent. And finally, Margie, on this topic.
I guess it won't surprise you to guess I might have a slightly different point of view. But so for anybody listening who's not aware, my members account for between 6 and 7% of national carbon emissions. And depending on, again, how you count it, probably more than 15% of Australia's total energy use. So predominantly electricity, but we also are very large users of thermal energy in different parts of our life. So we're big and we don't hide from that. And that's a topic for a whole different day of how aluminium is made from mine to market. So these are big emitters, but they're also very big companies. And each of these big companies that are sort of typically my members will have 2050 targets, and those targets will be supported by near-term goal targets, and that those will be set at a corporate level. So they'll have committed to certain reductions, usually by 2030, 2035. Everyone's got slightly different scope and different coverage. But it's really important to remember, well, we often just look at Australia in isolation and we look at it and we go, well, that facility hasn't done, whatever project. These companies are looking at their global abatement cost curves, and they are looking for where the least cost abatement is across their whole global portfolio in order to be able to achieve it. And they are undertaking actions across their global portfolios. But as we've discussed, there are some challenges, and as being said, there are billions of these assets are worth billions of dollars. So these decisions are, not made lightly. But the challenges that Australia has had and continues to have in its energy markets, and the challenge we have in deploying capital, Australia is a very expensive place at the moment to undertake a capital project, means that on that list, multinationals are facing, Australia is not necessarily the place today where we are deploying some of those projects that we would have otherwise ideally liked, because companies are looking for a least cost abatement within their global portfolio. I would also disagree that companies aren't doing anything because they're not aiming for 100%, because they're aiming for 100%. So again, for some of my sites, my sites that currently use thermal energy are looking to electrify. That's our pathway. We can see how it works. We're spending a lot of time and money with ARENA testing, developing new technologies. But even to put in, a step change for us, so not going for 100%, but a step change at the Lower Refinery, is still a quantum of available electricity, which is not necessarily available in local market, particularly in, say, Southwest WA. I would also say on the upside is some things that if you'd said to me 5 years ago, you'll be talking about, this as reality, I would have laughed and told you were dreaming. And yet some things that 5 years ago seemed quite hypothetical in our industry are actually now reality or about to become so. So we just need to be not too cynical that companies aren't doing anything. They are acting. We just need to sometimes be a little bit patient that 2050 is not today.
Thanks for that. I really appreciate the reminder that the pace of change can change pace as well. Like you said, things 5 years ago maybe didn't seem so possible, and we need to not be cynical in that. And I also like the appreciation that different sectors can be extremely different in what they face, and also are balancing their global markets. So all very interesting. I'll move on to my next question now. Could you each please give me an example of a large emitting facility that you know of? And you don't have to name them by name, but a facility which has done something really innovative or clever that will or has or will reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. I'll let anyone jump in on that one if you have one at hand that you want to share.
I'm happy to kick the ball off, and I guess it sort of segues from my previous comment about, what happened 5 years ago, and if you'd asked me, what would I have said? So I think, obviously for our sector, as I said, uses about 15% of Australia's East Coast electricity. And what we're seeing today is in a couple of different ways is the ways in which the aluminium sector is partnering with renewable energy generators. So about half our emissions are Scope 2 emissions associated with that purchase of electricity of the smelters. And in recent years, we've seen companies make really strong commitments. Now, the timing of those commitments is determined by the timing of their contract. So, for example, the Boyne smelter up in Gladstone, where Rio Tinto has been out in the market for that, the timing of that is determined. They've had a long-term contract that expires at the end of 2029. So that's sort of set the pace in terms of the when, which is another important thing to remember, the timing of contracts. But in Gladstone, so Rio Tinto has been contracting for over 4 gigawatts of renewable energy to replace the current 1 gigawatt of renewable energy that the Boyne smelter uses at the end of the contract. That will also let them supply renewable energy into some of the other facilities we have up in Gladstone, the 2 alumina refineries. But also what's really important is that new 4 gigawatt partnership that Rio Tinto will have with the clean energy markets in central Queensland, and that's solar, wind and firming, will fundamentally transform not just that smelter, but it actually transforms the central Queensland grid. And they become that base load that is needed in order to undertake transformational change. And these facilities can act at a scale which frankly are beyond the scale that most other operations can act at. And the fact that you can change the grid in a whole region with the actions of one company is something which is, I think really innovative and clever, and is helping to lead the way in terms of what can we do and what can we do differently.
Yeah, really innovative and exciting to think of the broader impacts of that one facility or one company is able to have like that. That's really fantastic.
If you'd said to me 5 years ago Rio Tinto would be Australia's largest renewable energy procurer, I would have been surprised, and here we are today.
So what's going to happen in 5? We'll get to that later. But maybe Ben or Trent, do you have any examples you want to share as well?
Yeah, it's Ben here. I think following on from Margi, like when you look at the Pilbara, without naming any companies specifically, but the big miners are all up there, or mostly up there. It's exciting to see the first kind of learner battery electric haul trucks arriving, ready for trialing and ready for commissioning. So that's a really important contribution to displacing diesel, and that up until recently was considered a pretty hard to abate application. In fact, I remember starting some of the modelling on that in around 2017, 2018, and even back then it was actually looking economic if you can develop those battery electric ultra class or smaller haul trucks. It was looking competitive with diesel even then. So it's really cool to see them come through, and that will sort of inform the next steps in sort of scaling up of deployment of those battery electric material movement solutions. And that extends to battery electric locos as well for sort of those multi-kilometre trains up there in the Pilbara. There's some pretty exciting stuff happening there that's displacing a lot of diesel, and some of it's sort of getting energy for free, on the downhill from pit to port. And then, so that's the sort of mining end of the value chain. But when you look at the minerals processing, then in the iron ore space, there's a pretty exciting JV testing direct reduced iron. So it's a type of electric smelting furnace that can use renewable electricity. There's another large company, trialing direct electrochemical reduction. So that's using sort of chemistry and a fairly low temperature solution, or not as hot, to directly, reduce iron ore. And then in Margi's space, in the aluminium value chain, we've got carbonless anode technologies that have existed for a while. Again, one of the partners that Margi mentioned, hydrogen electric calcinations coming along. That's important for alumina refining. And we're actually helping. We've supported the Gladstone example that Margi mentioned there on those very large renewable power procurements. So, that advancing of firm green power at low cost, that's critical. And we're also helping with some of the more, energy efficient initiatives. So double digestion is an important way to reduce the energy input required to refine alumina. We also need to sort of get better at operating flexibly. And all of these elements sort of come together. We really do need to sort of go back to the fundamentals when we look at how these future sort of energy and energy intensive industries work, because we have to unwrite some of the rules that our electricity infrastructure was built around, in terms of assumptions about firmness and about the ability of consumers to change or to be choosing to change how they consume energy, the types of appliances that are appearing. So it's pretty cool to see us sort of going back to the fundamentals and unpacking or sort of backing out some of the baked in assumptions about how our infrastructure and how our markets work to enable some of these cool sort of emerging technologies, particularly in the electrification space. Sorry, I might just add though that's all sort of cool and fun and sexy on the consumption side, but on the supply side, in terms of what's powering those newly electrified applications, we already have all the technologies we need. That's the pretty exciting thing. Like we've got low cost renewables, low cost storage. So now that we're sort of well advanced in the energy transition on the supply side, it's great that we're sort of turning to the end users like the heavy materials movement and the minerals processing we're talking about.
Very cool. It's so exciting. There's something deeply satisfying to my engineering brain just hearing you list some of these things. Maybe Trent, do you have anything to add as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it looks like I'm the contrarian on the call, but I think, I certainly see a lot of the work that the aluminium industry is doing really important with the renewable energy procurements, and ERM is helping to transact some of those large PPAs. But yeah, I think for me, I think whilst a lot of the big sort of ticket arena funded projects or whatever, they tend to get media attention. In my experience, it's the companies which take energy out of procurement functions and sort of manage it as more of a strategic issue that start to sort of achieve, more clever things in the way that they're doing, using energy and approaching their climate plans. So, yeah, I mean, I've worked with quite a few. I tend to work in food and beverage manufacturing, a little bit in waste and a couple other industries, but and I've worked with several clients, and I know of others that have been able to reduce their resource intensity, energy intensity, water intensity by 20 to 25% over a 5-year time frame, or sort of more or less with pretty concerted programs. And I find that that's really exciting just to see sort of how companies can snowball their activities. So one example is JVS Australia. They've done a lot of work across all of their different facilities. They've really, discovering really good, innovative, often quite low cost projects to reduce water usage or improve the thermal intensity of their plant. And then they just get together as a team once a month, all the engineering managers of the sites, share ideas, what worked and what didn't work. And then they're able to kind of socialize those ideas, and then other people can take them on. And the business has already seen it work in practice, so they can say, yep, that's worthwhile. Let us invest in that project. So sometimes just, all the small bits aggregating up can deliver a really good result, and sort of just get everyone on board and sort of really produce a better momentum towards emissions reduction. So yeah, I thought it'd be good to throw a different idea into the mix.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I'm interested to hear, do any of you have an example, again, you don't have to name them, of a facility that has turned its back on a good solution, on one that would have cut emissions, and maybe why did that happen? Maybe I'll start with Trent, if you have one.
I've worked on many energy audits and decarbonisation strategies and seen lots of great examples that haven't gone ahead. And, that's just part of the reality. I think, that there can be good solutions, but they don't necessarily meet, the right timing for the business or priorities. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I did have probably it was an example. I worked on the initial feasibility studies that led into the Hydrogen Park Murray Valley project, which is, in its own right, it's a great project. It's looking at injecting hydrogen into the local gas grid for Wodonga. But, the initial work we were doing on that was suggesting that they could produce biogas, upgrade it to biomethane, and inject it into that gas grid that runs immediately adjacent to the facility. So that's just one example where, I think that because of the attention that was being given to hydrogen at the time, and that there were, various industry bodies interested in investing in hydrogen, that instead of doing what I felt was a much easier solution, which is sticking the biogas straight into the grid, the biogas is being combusted in a cogeneration facility to produce electricity, to run a electrolyzer to produce hydrogen, and then the hydrogen is being injected into the grid. So that's one of the examples where I don't know if it was the best solution in the end, but these are the sorts of realities when good projects meet the politics of the day.
Yep, that certainly does sound like an interesting example. Maybe, Margie, do you have any to add?
Not so much an example is probably I think, Trent, we could all be the contrarian in the group because I don't like the question in terms of, I think it doesn't address, and probably to Trent's point, it doesn't address economics, physical and commercial realities in terms of, yes, it might be a great climate solution. So we just commissioned a report into mineral carbonation in our industry. Potential climate solution, but it only works when carbon is $700 a ton. So yes, it's a solution, but not at any price. And also, what's the physical and commercial realities? And I think often people do go out there and they do energy efficiency audits or whatever, but they don't see the kind of all of the other things that you have to make work. So, for example, electric boilers are a known technology in the alumina refining industry, but they're only technically proven at certain temperature ranges. And they also need to be located in areas with large volumes of electricity, like hundreds of megawatts of available electricity at internationally competitive prices. And we don't have that here in Australia. I dare you to find somewhere that someone's sitting on just a couple of 100 meg of electricity at an internationally competitive price. But also, if that alumina refinery, for example, has a 20-year gas contract, they can't just stop that contract today and go and switch to electricity. They need to wait until they get, within a certain time frame at the end, and the electricity is available for the gas to be able to implement, say, an electric boiler. So I think things might look good on paper, but reality is often a very different world.
Absolutely. And then I guess it comes back to what makes a good solution. Are we considering all the dimensions necessary to evaluate that? Then
I was just going to build on that and say, the phenomenon Margie mentioned about, having to run out contracts. Absolutely, it's the case that every day there's procurement decisions made today where we can be making smart decisions that sort of anticipate technology changes or cost changes that are going to be happening in the next few years. So things like procuring electricity supply or tendering for replacing part of a truck fleet. Every one of those procurement sort of cycles locks you in to a status quo for the next 3 or 5 or 10 years.
Yep.
And you do lose the opportunity to make that positive change. So in many cases, like a very long-term power or gas contract, for example, you've just locked yourself into a legacy model that's going to leave you left behind, like Kodak. Or, to Margie's point, some poor sod in the future is going to have to try and unwind your contract halfway through a bad contract term. So part of it right now is about sort of buying optionality and thinking ahead. And some of the big players, one of the ones that Margie mentioned, in those very large power procurements, they're engaging really early with power developers and communities to sort of bring the co-benefits to life. And that's the benefits of community engagement and community benefit for hosting those projects, even before they're hitting financial and final investment decision. So it's pretty exciting to know that, even though these assets are long-term investments, there are ways to work now and buy optionality and de-risk those long-term commitments by being smart with what you do in the short term.
Great. And I suppose that buying optionality would not have been thought of in the same way, 10 years ago. I'm interested to know now, turning to sort of mindsets and understandings, are there things that people who don't work in heavy industry often misunderstand or overlook when they think about what heavy industry should be doing to cut emissions? Maybe we could start with Margie.
Yeah, I think if you're coming from outside the industry, people often don't understand how closely monitored energy and emissions are and already, and that sustainability is kind of part of the DNA of these businesses. I mean, I started working on greenhouse gas accounting for some of these businesses more than 25 years ago. And energy accounting. So it's not like they've just come lately to this party. So for an alumina refinery or aluminium smelter, energy would be 30 to 40% of their costs. So they can tell you where energy is being used, how much and why, down to the second and sometimes microsecond. And energy efficiency or substitution projects often rank really highly in business cases. When they're filtering business cases, looking at what project can be done at that site for the year, obviously energy efficiency is a really easy way to do it. Even some of my smaller sites, like a bauxite mine, and I say smaller in terms of energy users, bauxite mine or extruder, would still be 10 to 30% of their cost. So it's still a really strong focus for them. And the other part, and picking up on the point which I think Ben just made, was around the community angle. So the sites that my members operate are very much part of the community. We have a little bit of FIFO, but even that's very regionally focused. Pretty much all our employees live and work in the communities in which they operate. They want their families to have a safe and healthy environment in all senses of the word. But they also really, they want the best thing for the future for their kids, including, a better planet to live on. And so they are constantly looking at how much, they can reduce emissions or what else they could do for alternate sources of energy. But sometimes the answer for our facilities lies in those long-term decisions that was discussed, which may have been made 20, 30, or even longer ago, years ago in our things, and also how much we need community acceptance of new projects outside the fence of our facility in order to be able to bring alternate sources of energy into the pipe.
Thanks, Margi. And maybe Ben next, if you had an answer to that.
Yeah,
one.
I think to Margie's point, when we think about the hard to abate emission sources, the facilities really tend to be optimized in their design around a very specific operating regime that's kind of locked in typically to a large degree at the time of development and construction. So many of the really major emission sources can't easily become more flexible or substitute fuels for cleaner versions or be more efficient or operating in a ramping mode to follow low cost or low emissions electricity. They're optimized upfront to the nth degree because that's what was smart to do at the time. That was the market and that was the economics that existed at the time to make them as competitive as possible. So I think what some people that don't work in heavy industry, misunderstand is that for a lot of heavy industry applications, you can't make incremental changes to gradually sort of reduce by 5% here, 7% there year on year. It typically requires a fundamental replumbing or, starting from a blank page for that facility. So there's quite a mismatch between the idealized sort of baseline reduction that you see in the safeguard mechanism and what is required in practice on the ground, which is typically like a wholesale change to that plant. So yes, there are projects that could get you 2%, 10%, 20% at varying economics. But when you have to make sort of deep emissions cuts, fundamentally, it's usually about a rethinking, a reconception of what that plant needs to look like. What's the design for the 2030s look like? Not what's the design for the 1980s look like.
Thanks, Ben. And over to you, Trent.
Yeah, I think it's just following on from both Margie and Ben, really. I mean, yeah, it's true. A lot of the big industrials have very good handle on how they're using energy, have done a lot of work to sort of pick the low hanging. There's lots of years of continuous improvement being undertaken to do things as well as they can, and they're all facing really difficult challenges at the moment to get secure supplies of low cost energy to continue to operate. And I mean, I think the key thing, just to build on Ben's point there, is that most of these large industrial facilities were built 40 to 50 years ago in the 70s and the 80s, and so decarbonising them basically just means rebuilding them from scratch. It's not just going, we'll change a little bit here, stick a new piece of plant, a bit of kit there, and all of a sudden it's decarbonised. A lot of it's going to be, whole drying lines or something need to be rebuilt around a different technology to accommodate something other than natural gas or, whatever it is. So in order to make that happen, you need a pretty significant amount of capital and a lot of long-term certainty in the Australian manufacturing and climate policy space. And that's not something that we've had for a while, unfortunately. So, but I think that the appetite is there, but, you're going to have that investment certainty for the next 20 or 30 years to say, okay, well, we're going to commit to a new plant and we're going to make sure it's got a very low emissions intensity. And that's going to mean it's going to cost a lot more, but we're doing this because we've got a 30, 40 year horizon we're looking towards.
It makes me appreciate once again the diversity of different sectors, optimized at the time of build, but might have had, very careful consideration of energy as its biggest cost. So it has options to decarbonize, or possibly does or doesn't have step changes or incremental changes like you've both said. So very interesting and diverse. And I'm curious to know, on the flip side, are there things that those running or owning the industrial facilities don't fully understand or don't pay enough attention to when they're deciding what to do about their emission? Can we start with Ben this time?
Yeah, sure. I think for those that are running or sort of owning industrial facilities, I think sometimes even relatively senior decision makers can fall short or be less aware than they could be of what their company's role is in a global market. And it sort of tends to be examined like many business cases. It's sort of a local asset with a local workforce and it's a local economic optimization. And that's where the story ends. But we're at a point in the game where you're not just competing on making the lowest cost product or the highest quality product today. You're part of a very complex, supply chain. Your buyers now care much more about the provenance of what they're buying than they did in the past, even a few years ago. And those buyers care that their supplier is, being strategically responsive to global trends, exactly as Trent says, like being strategic about how they're thinking about the future, how they're thinking about how they manage energy and carbon. And I think, whether it's the individuals or the role incentives or the corporate governance, one way or another, those considerations don't always get a look in when a business case or a consideration around investment is being kicked around a boardroom.
Thanks, Ben. Maybe over to you, Margie.
Yeah, look, I mean, my short answer would be no. I think actually I probably have a different point of view to Ben. I think people do understand where they sit, and we have a lot of discussion in our industry about things like green premiums. They're small. They're very, very small if they exist, is my comment today. But I think even from my biggest to my smallest members, I mean, the biggest lever that is large, and let me talk about climate emissions and not a range of other emissions. For climate emissions are mostly linked to either process emissions or source of energy. And I think even, as I said, even my smallest member, energy is just such a big component of their costs. But what can they do to change? And what can they do to change today? But in the context of, yes, they might be able to, but in that environment that we spoke about, where you've got long-term investment certainty, that Australia will have an internationally competitive energy market and policy certainty for the next 10, 20, 30 years, that's a hard set of. So I think people do understand, but these are not easy decisions.
And maybe finally over to you, Trent. What do people owning and managing industrial facilities not fully understand?
Well, I don't want to sort of try and speak for industrial facilities. And probably Margie, you have a better handle on some of those realities than I do. Actually, I was thinking, what are some of the consultants working in this space not fully understanding might be sort of a worthy question. I mean, I think probably one of the key point there is really interesting here, Margie, talk about green premium. I mean, I think from my end, often one of the concerns I have is that, let's say consultancies or people who are doing some of the analysis aren't necessarily connecting the business case to what the business drivers and commercial value is. How is this going to directly support the business to grow and develop? Often it's too narrowly sort of built around what are the energy savings, what's the capital cost. So, I do think that there is a lot of work there to sort of go and delve deeper into the business. How does this decarb opportunity actually integrate into your overall business strategy? Now, maybe for certain facilities, you're going to have very high energy costs, so it's pretty direct and obvious, but there's a whole range of parts of the economy, different industries and manufacturing businesses where, like the whole supply chain could benefit from a different way of thinking about, a particular way of a process that they have or whatever it might be. So, I do think that there's an orientation that's needed to consider more what commercial value looks like for the business and how do you structure the decarb opportunities around those. And the other key thing is around climate risk, so understanding how resilient is your business to climate change and, what are your physical and transition risks? How are you planning for the future in response to climate risks? That might be things like flooding, bushfires. There might be, other issues that are going to affect the supply. How do you then sort of ensure that you're speaking to a response to those climate risks? Because again, that connects to the business strategy as a whole.
Continuing on this theme, does anyone want to talk about where you're seeing the biggest gap between ambition and delivery in industrial decarbonisation? Could we start maybe with Margie?
I'm probably not seeing kind of the gap that you're seeing. So, you know what I mean? My view of a gap probably comes down to my view of a gap probably comes down to the answer I said earlier in terms of, I think a lot of times people thinking in really short-term time frames, we need to be thinking in, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, not months to years for these facilities. So I think that perhaps my perception of the gap is quite different to others.
Maybe over to you, Ben, on this one.
Yeah, I think the biggest gap is talking again around sort of timing mismatches or cadence pace mismatches between policy and readiness of the grid. If we're talking electrification, the investment cycles around assets, those different tempos or paces really create challenges in terms of closing those gaps. But what we can be doing to close the gaps is, making sure that we're thinking in the full system. So taking a system thinking approach that says, okay, what if we factor in the community? What if we extrapolate to, forecast or infer future green premiums? What are we thinking about the future price on carbon, however that manifests in international or Australian markets? How do we develop skills in the right areas? How do you focus on, delivery risk when it comes to, rollout of renewable energy zones, for example? That's how we can close that gap. It's the one thing we can sort of control. Like, we can't control the pace of change of technology or, how fast policy can adapt to markets or technologies, but we can, change the way we think, change the way we invest in skills, and, change the way we think about, managing the risks that come with that pace of change.
And over to you, Trent, on the gap between ambition and delivery.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think, I think for me, this long-term issue is long-term sort of planning or sort of view ahead is really important. I mean, I think that unfortunately, for me, the biggest challenge is actually large industrial facilities having to close or being closed, going to administration. I mean, that was kind of the rolling headlines of 2025 was, bailouts or large industrial facilities having to close, and I did some work in the past at the Oceania Glass. Australia's only float glass manufacturing facility consumes about 2 petajoules of natural gas per annum, and unfortunately it closed, and that was an outcome now where we are going to buy our glass that goes into making windows and various commercial building sort of glass items, glazing systems from China and other parts of the world, and that's an unfortunate outcome we're in, because they use, it's very hard for that facility, well, for one, to access low cost energy, but two, to be able to decarbonise in the context of the way their operations are. So, that's a big issue here, and I don't want to see a situation where, and a lot of these companies are owned by international investors. They might have a factory in Thailand and China and somewhere else in the world, and they're looking at it going, well, should we keep the one in Australia or do we invest in the one in Thailand? So these sorts of decisions, I don't want to end up in a position where we're saying, well, whereas the Australian industry continues to get eroded because the market signals aren't there, the policy setting isn't there. So it's going to take a concerted, coordinated effort to make sure we keep sort of investing and growing Australian industry in a direction that's going to align to a net zero future.
A lot of the facilities have obviously been impacted by the safeguard mechanism, which I think is just a fascinating topic. So the reform safeguard mechanism, which is obviously the federal scheme that aims to reduce carbon emissions from sort of the heavier around 215 facilities. This year and next year, the scheme will be under review. I'm interested to know, if each of you were in charge of updating it, how would you change it? Perhaps we could start with Margi.
I think one thing that's really important to think of is that while we've had the safeguard in various previous forms for quite a few years, and we went into it with a good understanding of the data, in its current form, we've only been running the safeguard for 2 years. We'll only have 2 years worth of data. And so there are definitely some elements that we think could be improved, things that we didn't get the design quite right, which we've now tested and so forth. And I think we need to make sure that there are guardrails to start to set the direction beyond 2030. But I think radical change would be the thing I would not do if I was in charge, because industry is on a path, and this is about decarbonising industry, and we need to keep setting long-term clear policy guidance, not short-term chopping changing. It's going to create sovereign risk. And remember, looking at that very first 2 years worth of data, noting we're now in the third year, but we'll only have 2 years worth of data. The only projects you'll actually have seen being implemented must have been pretty much like shovel ready on the day that the scheme changes came in. So companies that are, things that are triggered just as a response to safeguard will rarely at these companies actually been implemented. Now, so you are seeing projects. Those are projects because these companies are already on a decarbonisation journey, but they're not necessarily exactly kind of in response to safeguard. So slow and steady, set as we discussed before, long-term policy and long-term policy certainty. So keep forecasting for the guardrails, but the last thing we need is substantial upheaval and change.
And maybe over to you, Trent. If you were in charge of the safeguard mechanism for this review, what would you do?
It was probably a good thing I'm not in charge of that. I think it's going to be a challenging task. I mean, I think, and Margi's point, I think we need to be careful about chopping and changing. But I think from my end, if you look at the Treasury modelling that underpinned the 2035 government's sort of nationally determined contribution emissions targets, like the role of industrial decarbonisation at 2035 is pretty tiny, or sort of anticipated to be pretty small. And, their own modelling shows what the contribution from the safeguard mechanism is going to be. And most of it is the closure of facilities like coal mines and power generation facilities, which probably need to close anyway in order to sort of align to those, the emissions trajectories that the government's aiming for. And the actual quantity of abatement that's expected from physical actions on site, it's about 18%. So, I mean, I don't think that's particularly the message the Australian public's been sold on industrial decarbonisation and its role in reducing emissions. I mean, so 18% of what industry's contribution is, that only 18% of that is from physical action. So, but the big issue there is, as some industries will reduce their emissions, they'll drop out of the safeguard mechanism, so you get by 100,000 tonnes and boom, all of a sudden you're no longer a safeguard facility. So is there a question there? I mean, I'm not the expert to really be saying exactly what you should be doing, but I think I'm interested, is there a conversation about lowering that threshold so that you keep enough coverage of Australia's industrial facilities in that scheme?
Yeah, it certainly will be interesting to see if they lower that threshold, because as you'd know, some work has been done.
So if I can jump in and pitch an idea here. So it's something we've contemplated. Obviously, most of my members, like 99% of my facilities are outside Gulf facilities. So we've kind of got less skin in the game perhaps than others in terms of that lowering the threshold. But, and again, thinking about this in the context that Australia undertook a large productivity review, and at the time people were talking about lower the threshold is 25,000. Well, you bring in a lot of companies and there'd be a lot of reporting, but not much more emissions. And I guess the view, when we've put this on the record from our side, is say, okay, well, in 2035, it's going to go down to 75,000 tonnes. In 2040, it's going to go down to another 25,000 tonnes, down to 50,000 tonnes. If you do that, what you actually do is you are setting that long-term policy signal. So if you're sitting at 90,000 tonnes today, you actually now have an investment signal with no paperwork to reduce to less than 75,000 by 2035, because otherwise you're going to have to start doing the paperwork. And then you have another investment signal that says you're going to have to keep investing to keep running ahead of that curve, but it minimises the reporting and the bureaucracy, but it keeps that threshold moving while providing a long-term investment signal.
Yeah, thanks, Margi. And Ben,
I think lowering the threshold is one thing that's been floated, but I think the other optional degree of freedom there is expanding the coverage to additional sectors like transport. That's obviously politically bold, as the saying goes, because the challenge is where that cost ultimately lands. Like, will it translate to higher grocery prices for consumers, or will it impact productivity, as Margi said? And there's also, policy designs are really hard. There are risks, if you cover rail, for example, but road freight's not covered, then that can shift demand from rail to road, which worsens congestion on the roads, potentially increases the overall emissions from transport. So it's definitely a fraught exercise. To Trent's point, I'm grateful I'm not responsible for it, but I agree that, that Margi's point about radical change or short-term chopping and changing, the businesses really do need those early signals when it comes to policy changes, so they have time to incorporate new strategic responses and plan their budgets and their actions accordingly. It really is going to take us to coordinate industry and policy, continue coordinating those, particularly in hard to abate sectors where you can't just fund improvements out of OPEX. It's major capital investments that need a decade of advance to be able to commit. That's coordination is going to be key to advancing or accelerating our emissions reduction.
So actually in that answer, Ben, I heard you use the term hard to abate. Interested to know, in your opinion, what do you think about the term hard to abate? Is there still such a thing as hard to abate sectors? And if there is it a smaller group of industries than it was a few years ago? Interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I definitely think hard to abate still is meaningful. I think it generally means sort of it may be technically possible at the fringe of our technical capability, but it's probably prohibitively expensive and it's not yet at scale. So that's still definitely true. Like aviation's a good example. You've got options like stable aviation fuel and synthetic fuels. They've progressed, but they remain very expensive. And so I wouldn't actually say there are any fewer hard to abate industries or hard to abate sectors. It's more like the hard bits have got slightly less hard, but for some of them they have flipped over. So what's really changed is sort of battery electrification of heavy transport applications like heavy locos, buses, haul trucks. Now even short hop ferries or short hop personal aviation. That's been a game changer just in the last sort of 5 to 8 years. So I think there's still the same family of hard to abate sectors. The picture's looking slightly better, and on the margins, there are whole classes of emitters that are flipping to suddenly being economic. The total cost of ownership for a battery electric passenger vehicle for most applications is now better than the total cost of ownership for an internal combustion equivalent. And once that happens, you just get this runaway economic deployment. Like that's economics playing out then. That's not incentives or policies or any of that stuff. That's just people buying what's cheapest. And that runaway effect is really going to snowball as those kind of electrification technologies ping pong around all the different industries that are going to be drawing on them.
So still a valid term, but maybe there's some slightly less hard to abate sectors, but there's not that doesn't have a ring to it. Slightly less hard to abate. No, but I'll pass over to you, Trent, before we go to Margi on this hard to abate.
Yeah, I mean, I think my view on this is that everyone thinks their sector's the hard to abate sector. I mean, I don't know if anyone's there sitting and think, it's really easy for us to decarbonise. We're in the easy to abate sector. I mean, I think there are some which practically very difficult and challenging. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's just each organisation, each business, each sector, they're just focusing on their own challenges. And I mean, there's a lot of great work being done at the moment, research and development, and evaluating different ideas that are out there. Because I think that's where we're at. We, probably had these big picture ideas. Now we're sort of okay at that point of deploying these things in the field, and how do we make it work? And I think, so that's where it's starting to go. Okay, well, how do we turn, let's say mechanical vapor recompression in the aluminum industry? How do you make that work? What sort of challenges? How do we build a program around it? What does the business case really look like? And that's going to take quite a few years. And then we'll have a sense of, okay, is it actually a really useful solution to the industry? Or is it something that isn't going to work? I mean, it's pretty proven technology, but I think, so that's where I probably sit more in that reality of like the term hard bait doesn't really add much. I think it's each sector's there just going, well, it's all a difficult challenge. And what are we doing to get it done?
And Margi, finally, what's your perspective on this?
I probably sit even further down the spectrum, in that I hate this term and I never use it because I think it makes abatement sound impossible. And so it's certainly speaking for the aluminium sector, and by aluminium I mean vertically integrated from mine to market. We are not hard to abate. We are, however, not easy, not cheap and not fast, but we are not hard to abate. We have a pathway to decarbonise our industry globally by 2050, and now, that doesn't mean it can be done by 2030 just by waiting more by magic policy wands. But we can have a structured plan that rolls out global decarbonisation of the aluminium industry over the next 20 to 25 years. That does require coordinated policy that supports those investments, both inside and outside the fence. And the timeline for that policy certainty needs to be a lot longer than our electoral cycle, which is a challenge. But, as Ben said, the economics starts to shift over that timeline. The next decade will be incredibly challenging in Australia for many industries, and we started to see the cusp of that. We were in an industry coming to the end of long-term contracts, but at the same time as our energy system is not quite ready to kind of take on the new challenge. So we've got a mismatch of timing and a mismatch of economics. But I haven't said those words out loud other than in the context of questions like this for more than 5 years.
Great. Coming back to your magical policy wand, my last question is, what technologies or policies do you expect to see in the next 5 to 10 years that would shift the dial in terms of cutting industrial emissions? And maybe we could start with Trent and then Ben and finish on Margi.
We just finished a report for Victorian Government on electric thermal energy storage, and I see that as being, in this time frame, 5 to 10 years, I think it's going to be a really key technology. I think the capacity for heat pumps to provide steam is still a little bit further off, but the idea of having a system that can store heat at 1,000 degrees or above, and then you're running water through that, producing steam that you can supply into a manufacturing facility, and then couple that with renewable electricity and, have some smarts around when you're charging your electric thermal energy storage at periods of low price or high renewable energy penetration. That kind of like adaptability of a facility, I think is probably the direction we need to go in. Whether it's, should be uniform across everything, I don't think so. But there's certain industries which make a lot of sense to take that approach with decarbonisation. So I'd love to see that happen more, and probably more support from government would be one area where they can help facilitate more uptake of that technology. Obviously, there's challenges around electricity networks and making sure you've got enough electrical capacity to accommodate it. But really interesting technology. I'm looking forward to seeing how that is rolled out.
Yeah, I think electrification is really at the foundation of most of the abatement we need to do, other than maybe agriculture and some other sources. But the precursor to that, or the condition precedent, is that, as Margi says, our energy system and our electricity system is ready to accommodate that load. And I think what we're really making pace on fast is energy storage technologies, particularly sort of alternative electrochemical storage chemistries, so battery chemistries. They're really going to accelerate and supercharge the remaining transition to a sort of primarily renewable system. But we need to be sort of supporting them and creating the changes in the market to underpin investment in energy storage, large-scale grid-connected energy storage projects. And those market changes are happening if you're following that. And if you remember the rollout of solar, it started slow. The business case was marginal. And then when it dropped through parity with grid power, it completely upended the economics of turning on your power point. So PV today is basically economic on every rooftop that's not shaded. And that looks like it's going to be happening again with batteries. And, if you follow the wholesale electricity market, what you can see happening is that collecting solar power, storing it in the battery until it's needed in the evening, is now competitive with evening wholesale grid prices. And it's getting cheaper. So that doesn't speak to sort of multi-day or how you deal with residual demand, but just looking at that one-day profile as an early data point is pretty compelling about what we're doing directionally. And, it's not about industry per se, but it sort of is, because both, industry and residential and commercial exposed sort of economic sectors, we share in the same pooled electricity market. And industry wants low-cost, firm power just as much as people and businesses do. So the faster we can accelerate low-cost energy storage, we're really hastening that tipping point.
Rural transition. Thanks, Ben. And Margi.
So I think coming in with a complementary view there, I always say energy is the answer to any question. So energy, energy, energy. As a country, we have to get better at delivering low carbon energy at scale and competitively priced and quickly. As an industry that uses, say, give or take 15% of Australia's electricity already, and as well as other sources of energy, we've obviously been thinking about this, and we've been, I guess, the proverbial canary in the coal mine of the electricity markets for the last 2 decades of transition. And what we've seen is that to get energy policy right, though, you actually need a supportive integrated policy ecosystem that really values not only the energy generation, but the energy user. Because so you need to have that integrated policy that can deliver energy price and availability. But Australia also needs to be a place that can attract that capital for transformational abatement to implement the energy. And we need to recognise the critical minerals that are very broad, much broader than Australia's current definition, that will be needed for energy storage, including aluminium's used in all of those technologies, but we're not a critical mineral in Australia today. But it's also how we think about what we've got here that's important for our trade and investment discussions. As well, obviously, we need to, and we saw legislation passed last year, we need to speed up our environmental approvals without reducing the quality of the outcome. And at the same time, ensuring that Australia supports free and fair trade at our borders so that we can keep the manufacturing capability we have. So energy is the simple answer, but energy needs to be supported by a complex industrial ecosystem. And what you find is if any one part of that doesn't work, as we've seen in the last 5 years, like if you can't get environmental approvals to go and build a new energy grid or transmission or locality, then the whole system starts to fail. So energy is the answer, but it's a complicated definition of energy to get there.
Great. Thank you so much. And I think over to you, Murray, for our last question.
So I've had a very easy run of it so far, but I'm going to come back in with the one last question. And it's a sort of big picture kind of question. What fact or insight do you wish was more widely known because it would help us to move faster to a cleaner, greener, better world? And Ben, if you kick us off.
I think what fact or insight I would wish was more widely known was that the energy transition isn't a theoretical thing in the future. It's actually already here and it's working really well. The energy system, to Margi's point earlier, it really is ready to take on the challenge. We hit another milestone in the national electricity market in the last quarter of 2025. So you might have seen renewable energy and storage for the first time supplied more than 50% of the quarterly electricity market needs for the first time. And we'll probably all remember when there was thinking that, well, certainly earlier in my career, there was this accepted wisdom that we need to keep renewables below 20% or the grid's just not going to hang together. The last quarter of 2025, we're now at 50%. We're rocketing higher, and wholesale electricity prices in that same quarter saw massive reductions relative to the same quarter in the previous year. So 40, 50% plus wholesale electricity price reductions for that same window. So the energy transition is absolutely here and it's working great.
That's a very upbeat answer. Ben, thanks very much. Margi, over to you.
Yeah, I think, I guess picking up, it's a question of what Australia getting to being a leader. I think one thing we need to focus on is it's a bit of the Pareto principle. I'm a big fan of keeping it simple. What's the 80-20 rule? And I fear, mine's kind of the reverse, is Australia should definitely play its part and help lead the world, but it doesn't mean we need to lead on everything. And I fear at the moment we're spending a lot of time on reporting and more schemes and systems and things like that. And we actually don't necessarily, in my view, need those. Energy is going to be the answer to how we solve this and how we get to a faster to a cleaner, greener, better world, not reporting.
That's a great answer. It ties nicely back to your earlier comment that whatever the question, the answer is energy. Trent, bring us home. What's your fact or insight?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, interesting. I don't have a sort of energy industry insight or fact on this one. I mean, I can't remember the specific numbers, but hearing a poll that the majority of people, probably as in America, didn't trust people in general, but they had a much higher level of trust in their neighbours. And I just thought, that's really interesting. We have this kind of like polarized world where, people are in different camps and they, have these confirmation bias kind of realities. They don't want to believe what other people say. But I think once we start to kind of break down those bridges and just meet each other as individuals and have the conversation, have the communication, understand, the realities of, a business, what are they operating in? What are the day-to-day realities of them? Or what's that individual? What's their life like? How do they function? We just all that kind of like those sort of big, strong arguments and worldviews can start to dissolve and we just kind of meet reality as it is. And I guess for me, like that's kind of really important, as well as all this technical stuff around how we decarbonize is, just how we're sort of building community, building a sort of collective response to just the needs that we have in the world today and the current challenges and problems that we're faced with.
That's a terrific answer. A chat over the back fence. That's I really like it. Thanks so much to you all. Franziska and I have really enjoyed hearing your answers, haven't we, Franziska?
Absolutely. Yeah, really appreciate your time too. Super interesting and helpful. Thanks, Ben, Trent, Margi. Thank you so much.
So, Franziska, that was a great chat. What were some of the highlights for you?
I'm remembering the magical policy wand. That was a highlight that Margi pointed out doesn't exist. No, but the key highlights for me was reflecting on the varied approaches to industrial decarbonisation that differ between different facilities. You've got incremental changes that come together in a sort of management system, an energy management system, for example, but you've also got some facilities with opportunities for step change that can make big impacts, but they're all different and all on their own journey.
Yes, indeed.
What about you, Murray?
Well, look, I loved the way all three of them answered the question of, what do you think about hard to abate? So I loved that Margi said, the aluminium industry is not hard to abate. I mean, that was just such a great answer. And I loved Trent's answer that, there's nobody out there who thinks they're easy to abate. Like this is real.
We're an easy to abate facility.
Yeah. Nobody puts their hands up and says it. And then Ben, of course, was saying, yes, they're still hard to abate, but maybe a little less hard to abate than they were. So, yeah, I just love those answers. Anything else come to mind for you in that chat?
I also really appreciated the discussion around how decisions made 10, 20 or more years ago can kind of lock in or restrict your ability to make changes now, or that just create a different set of changes you have to think about. And I particularly like that we are now thinking about how to lock in flexibility going forward for things we can't yet anticipate in industrial decarbonisation, or the things we might need to adjust in the future.
Yes.
I appreciate the kind of the long-term view here of we've been wrong before, or we haven't known everything in the past and we can't know everything now, but we've got to keep our head above and look to the horizon of the direction we're heading.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I tell you my favourite statistic?
Tell me.
Yes, it came from Trent, and I'm hoping I'm remembering it properly. And he said that if you look at where the safeguard emissions reductions are supposed to come from, a very large proportion of them are from closures, closures of coal mines and closures of coal-fired power stations as we transition and build up, clean industrial facilities as well. One more thing that I loved was it was a response to something by Trent. We said, the question you asked was, is there anything that industrial owners and operators of industrial facilities should keep more in mind, but don't? And his response was, well, maybe there's things that consultants to them should keep in mind, but don't, which I thought was a very sort of humble answer. And of course, they do know a lot and bring a lot into it. I mean, he is part of that industry.
They do, like he said, struggle to really deeply understand the broader picture of each company, right? That's what he was pointing to. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. So that was a great moment, I thought. But yes, they're a kind of very knowledgeable, hands-on crew. And
Very,
yes, I was
yeah.
very feisty and fun. Well, that's all. I hope
Feisty
you
and fun.
enjoyed the chat. Thanks for joining. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to rate us and share the episode with your colleagues. Bye for now.
Bye for now.
I'm just going to hit record. Sorry, not record.